I'm Ellis Martin. Join me for a conversation with Craig Shesky, the CFO of the Metals Company, trading on the NASDAQ as TMC. The Metals Company is an explorer of lower-impact battery metals from seafloor polymetallic nodules on a dual mission. One, to supply metals for the clean energy transition with the least possible negative environmental and social impact. And two, to accelerate the transition to a circular metal economy. The Metals Company, through its subsidiaries, holds exploration and commercial rights to 3 polymetallic nodule contract areas in the Clarion-Clipperton zone of the Pacific Ocean, regulated by the International Seabed Authority, sponsored by the governments of Nauru, Kiribati, and the Kingdom of Tonga. Go to the company's website, metals.co. I caught up with Craig at the Mines and Money Resourcing Tomorrow conference in London, England.
Craig, welcome to the program. It's great to see you here in London. It was just a few weeks ago that we were in Los Angeles.
It was. It's great to see you, Ellis, too. Always good to see you on the conference circuit, and it's a pleasure to be here.
You are touring the world and telling the story, which you have to do.
Spreading the good word.
And the good word is pending deal with the Japanese?
Yes, we were happy to report a couple of weeks ago that we signed a binding MOU with Pacific Metals of Japan to process the nodules potentially from our first vessel. One of the great things about this nodule resource is that we can really bring it anywhere for processing, anywhere where the infrastructure already exists. So as we've already done our successful collection test, bringing up 3,000 tons of nodules from the seafloor to the surface in late 2022, it's helpful to now have a partner who has the capability and expertise and facility ready to go to potentially process these nodules. Unlike many other competitors on land where once you get the permit, you then have to go out and raise billions of dollars, you have to construct the facilities over the course of a few years. In this situation, we now have a partner in Japan, pending our final agreement with them, where we can process these nodules at effectively no capex to TMC, using existing facilities that have been processing nickel laterites since 1965. And based on the fact that our nodules behave very much like laterites in the kiln, this is a perfect turnkey approach for processing the nodules from our first vessel.
And you have a near endless supply of nickel for them that would help Japan and probably even Korea.
Certainly. It's an area of the world where they have so much experience in resources, but also steel making and automaking. And one of the great things about these nodules, we're not just dependent on the EV sector, we're not just dependent on renewables, but also so much of nickel already goes into stainless steel. And the stainless steel market continues to grow at a above GDP clip globally, and there's plenty of steel makers, whether it's South Korea or Japan. And when we have our manganese silicate product as the byproduct for the post-processing nodules, that is a product that can be delivered into the steelmaking industry with very minimal modifications. It would actually be a direct replacement for manganese ore in the creation of silica manganese, which goes into steelmaking blast furnaces. So it's a good region of the world to be in for a very high quality product that we believe, and Sintef out of Norway believes, could offer 7 to 17% higher value in use and lower carbon. So while a lot of the focus is on some of our metals like nickel, copper, and cobalt, the manganese product is one that shouldn't be ignored. 30% of future revenue in our view, and being produced in an area where we think there's going to be a lot of interest for off-takers.
How soon does this turn into revenue for the company and potentially for shareholders?
We anticipate being in production around the end of 2025. We came out with an update in August, laying out our timeline and how that corresponds with the International Seabed Authority's timeline, given their addition of a few meetings to finalize the rules, regulations, and procedures to allow commercial exploitation of marine resources, namely polymetallic nodules. We anticipate being the first company in history to apply for a mining contract for exploitation within international waters. We anticipate filing that application following their July 2024 session, and assuming a one-year review period, that would put us into commercial production by the end of 2025.
I've interviewed you several times, and from what I understand, you have one of the least, if not net zero carbon footprints in the mining industry with regard to nickel. Basically, you're not even really mining, you're picking up these nodules with a very low impact on the seafloor compared to, let's just say, yachting or anything. And yet Greenpeace boarded your vessel.
There was a time when Greenpeace would call for more science, saying that before we rush into an industry like deep sea mining, and by the way, nobody's rushing in. This is an industry that's been under development for many decades now. And the decision to begin this new industry is in the hands of sovereign nations, the 168 member states plus the European Union that represent the International Seabed Authority. Now, to date, Greenpeace and some of their fellow environmental groups have been pushing and calling to say, we don't know enough about this environment, that there isn't enough science. To that call, we have answered, and we have been conducting environmental research campaigns for really 11 years at this stage, and we are now on our 20th environmental campaign at sea in the Clarion-Clipperton Zone of the Pacific Ocean. Some of the initial preliminary data that's come out on the environmental impacts has been very encouraging. In fact, our environmental lead, Dr. Michael Clark, gave a webinar roughly 2 weeks ago that explained what are some of the environmental impacts that folks have been worried about, including the seafloor plume. The initial results are that the impact is much lower than what has been speculated and reported on in the media. This is all positive news. A lot of the fruit is now being borne from the investment that we've made over the last decade, spending over $150 million on this environmental research program. And now we're seeing some of those initial results, and the data is pointing in the right direction. So Greenpeace, who once called for more data, has now seen that data and is boarding our research vessel saying it's time to stop this research, stop collecting data. So it is a bit of a hypocritical approach based on what they previously said. The world has called for this research to be done. In fact, we're doing this campaign based on the recommendation of the International Seabed Authority's Legal and Technical Commission. So the sovereign nations of the world wanted to see this additional data. We're providing it, but now Greenpeace has boarded our vessel in protest, trying to get us to stop collecting data. It's an unfortunate situation, but it is something where we are availing ourselves of all legal measures. In fact, we filed for injunctive relief in Dutch courts earlier this week, and we expect a decision imminently. So while this is an attempt to slow down the industry, I think it shows that even Greenpeace knows the train here is leaving the station and that the data is pointing in the right direction. And again, the decision for this to go forward is not going to be up to Greenpeace, but rather the sovereign nations of the world.
What vessel of yours have they boarded?
Well, if you view some of Greenpeace's statements, they're calling it a mining vessel or a drilling vessel. This is actually a scientific research expedition. There is no nodule collection going on. This is the collection of data. So dozens of independent scientists are on board assessing the environmental impact of the marine environment following our collector test, which occurred roughly 12 months ago. So it's exactly the type of data that the world has been calling for to give confidence in this new industry. And that's the kind of data that Greenpeace is trying to prevent coming out to the world. We don't believe they'll be successful. And while they've slowed down some of our research over the course of a couple of days, we have additional parts of this campaign that are continuing, and we can reshuffle certain actions. The bottom line is we don't believe that this illegal action from Greenpeace is engendering much favor for them within the International Seabed Authority and its member states. They are actively trying to obstruct the process that was agreed upon in the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, as well as the ISA's 1994 implementation agreement. So we're very confident that this protest won't go much further, but again, to the extent that they do want to stay on the vessel, we will be continuing to seek injunctive relief, and we expect results from that hearing to come at any moment.
Well, I think this is a very dangerous place for Greenpeace to be because they open themselves up to the world's scrutiny right now, because they will open themselves up to a lot of scrutiny right now in their practices in general. I would think it would impede them from future events if that injunction succeeds, and especially if you have the attention of the UN, which I know listens to this broadcast.
Yeah, it's a good point, and I can't speak for what Greenpeace's actions will be from here. They have decided that this industry shouldn't go forward, but it's important to keep in mind that the International Seabed Authority was formed with a dual mandate. First, to establish exploration regulations to allow us to discover what is on the seafloor and then what are the environmental impacts of potential future mining, but then to also establish a mining code, rules, regulations, and procedures which allow commercial exploitation. This is not a situation where the ISA is deciding should this happen or shouldn't it. We believe that decision was made many decades ago. Now it's the ISA's legal mandate to deliver a mining code which can allow for the safe exploitation of these resources. So we believe that Greenpeace is very interested in publicity. They're interested in fundraising. In fact, most of their money goes to marketing. So to us, that shows really where their motivations are. We believe that the data that we're collecting, which will be shared openly with the world, is going to make a strong case for the collection of polymetallic nodules, which can supply the metals needed for the clean energy transition.
What can we see during 2024 from the Metals Company?
Well, there are a few key milestones that are upcoming. We expect to finalize our environmental impact statement, and again, we will continue to host public webinars as we've been doing, summarizing the implications of that data collection, which spans the last decade. So our environmental impact statement, as well as our pre-feasibility work, which we anticipate to be finished by the middle of next year, are going to be key elements of our application to the ISA following their July 2024 session for an exploitation contract over our NORI-D area. area. We also anticipate that you're going to get more potential statements of support on the political front. In fact, you may have seen a couple of weeks ago, there were 10 U.S. senators, a bipartisan coalition, that are calling for the U.S. to ratify the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Now, because the U.S. has not ratified that UN convention, the U.S. does not have access directly to a resource like nodules in the Clarion-Clipperton Zone. However, that doesn't preclude companies like TMC from down the road bringing processing and refining to the United States if there is a political appetite for it. And in fact, you've now had various congresspeople from Texas writing to the Department of Defense in the Biden administration demanding that the U.S. has a plan for how we can bring these nodules to the U.S. There is also the House Armed Services Committee has directed in the annual military spending bill, the National Defense Authorization Act, they've directed the Pentagon to deliver a report on how the processing and refining of nodules can be done within the United States. And assuming that bill is passed, harmonized with the Senate version, and signed by President Biden, we would anticipate in 2024 having a report from the U.S. on how they're going to get a piece of this industry, even though they can't get a contract area themselves. All of those could be potential catalysts to look for on the horizon, but TMC is going to continue to control what we can control, and that's our environmental work, our pre-feasibility work, and our application to the regulator to begin commercial production, in our view, by the end of 2025.
What I find fascinating about all of this is that there are no permitting issues involved in the United States whatsoever, and not every nickel project gets permitted quickly or at all.
That's right. That's right. The U.S. is in a situation where nearly all of its nickel, manganese, and cobalt, which, by the way, are the three most important elements for a NMC cathode, nickel, manganese, and cobalt, the U.S. effectively has to import all of those materials today. Other than one mine in northern Michigan, the Eagle Mine, owned by Lundin, and that's expected to be sunset around the middle of this decade. Other than that mine, there is no primary production of those three critical battery metals. What TMC has from our first contract area alone could bring the U.S. to total self-sufficiency in nickel, manganese, and cobalt. So this isn't some solution on the margins. This isn't a call for permitting reform, or this isn't something where you're building the midstream and downstream processing capacity and then not really worrying about where the upstream mined capacity is coming from. This is a solution that could solve the issue for the United States when it comes to nickel, manganese, and cobalt. It is that potential opportunity that has put this in the spotlight from the U.S. government, despite the U.S. government not having a seat at the table officially with the International Seabed Authority.
Well, Craig, it's always an education. Thank you so much for joining me today at the Mines and Money Conference in London. I will see you somewhere soon on the road, I'm sure.
Absolutely, or at the pub.
I've been speaking with Craig Shesky, the CFO of the Metals Company, trading on the NASDAQ as TMC. Go to the company's website, metals.co. I'm Ellis Martin.
Would you like to be one of the first to see who we are following? Subscribe to our audio newsletter. It's free. EllisMartinReport.com.